is that they actually deliver the utmost kind of tantric ecstasy of flavor.
Right.
That they're the most thrilling, the most exciting wines, the deepest and the most enthralling. And not to have access to those wines as one is learning about wine, I think is really, it creates a vacuum. And it creates a gap, I think, in people's understanding. And there's absolutely nothing to be done about it. You have an awful lot of people chasing a very small amount of wines whose commodity value has been established by people who give 100-point scores.
Right.
You know, and I'm not taking shots at Parker or Spectator. That's a too easy a target, and frankly, a lot of the shots that are taken, particularly at Parker, are not warranted. But you have to understand, and Bob does understand, that a kind of melancholy, what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of a benefit. A kind of a melancholy phenomenon of his 100-point scale is that you tend to produce an inordinate amount of attention to the very tip of that iceberg. So anything that's getting 95 points and higher all of a sudden attracts the attention of people who simply need to have these wines which have now become trophies.
Yeah, so, and it's almost, I can't word it any other way than it almost leads them to where they want to go, and going away from just tasting. You know, it's just this wine is this. It's a commodity. That's really what it's come down to.
And you know, I find, I mean, if I try to imagine what the lives are like of the people who produce those wines, honestly, I would have to really, I'd be very, very sad thinking of the number of bottles of my wine that I send out into the world and the proportion of time that they're actually consumed by somebody who understands and loves them,
right,
as opposed to somebody who is measuring the size of his dick by them.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think it's an overwhelming majority of the latter and a very sad minority of the former. So you go to all this trouble to produce these marvelous world-class wines, and I'm sorry, but they end up being consumed by nimrods for the most part. You know, if you're talking about Bordeaux, you're already kind of in that big business nexus. And I don't shed an awful lot of tears for very many of them. But I do think about the kind of the noble paisans of Burgundy and Piemonte, and just think, what must it be like for them?
Does that push you to find more artisanal spots, not only in wherever region you're at, but all over the world? Or?
Well, you know, it would tend me to swim against that tide if I were in a position of making that decision consciously. Years ago, when I was interviewed for Food and Wine magazine, which was profiling me as Importer of the Year, I got asked a really good question. It was asked as a kind of a rhetorical question. Richard Nally asked it. He says, what's it like to have perennially unpopular taste? And my answer, which was out of my mouth before I could think about it, was just lucky, I guess. You know, because having unpopular taste tends to mean that your taste is steering you towards wines for which it is still a buyer's market.
Right.
And that means that in most cases, the kinds of wines that I enjoy drinking are wines that are still affordable.
Right.
And I don't have to kind of grope around the world of wine looking for something that's going to scratch that itch, because they're all still there. Now, to the extent that, for example, German wine remains affordable, you could say that honestly, it's a failure of marketing, not only on my part, but also on the part of other people who are trying to fight the same fight, selling high-quality German wines. And you know, Rudy Wiest and I have been doing this. Rudy's been doing it going on 30 years, and I've been doing it for 26. And we still haven't really gotten people accustomed to the notion that, let's say, in his case, you know, let's say it's a Fritz Haag Spätlese, in my case, a Dönhoff Spätlese, is something that not only would be worth paying $75 a bottle for, but is probably the best damn wine that $75 will buy.
Right.
And when I think about that, right now Gruner Veltliner is on my mind because I just came back from Austria, tasting a lot of these wines, which
2010s?
2010s and earlier vintages as well. Tasting a lot of these wines that are seriously competitive with not just decent white Burgundy, they're seriously competitive with excellent white Burgundy.
Wow.
And
for a fraction of the cost.
Yeah, at a fraction of the cost. You can buy great Gruner Veltliner for between 60 and 70 bucks, actually between 55 and 70 bucks. And incidentally, you also get something that's going to age uncomplicatedly and beautifully for 30 years, as opposed to modern day white Burgundy. I mean, we all know about this whole business with premature oxidation in white Burgundy, and I think it's fascinating that with all the discussion and the reams and reams and reams of prose that have been generated about this phenomenon,
no answer.
No answer. No cause has been found. Yeah. So, I mean, if it's up, and I love great white Burgundy, such as it used to be a generation ago. And I have no issue with, you know, I mean, I have an issue with somebody spending $170 for a quality that I could sell them for 40% of that price. But then what really exacerbates the issue is it's a pig in a poke. You're spending this enormous amount of money for a wine that may not even make it to 3 years. Right. And if you open it at 5 years on, full of hope and expectation, and you end up with something that's just decadent or matterized, you're out a whole bunch of scratch.
Yeah.
You know, and not only is that not going to happen with my Gruner Veltliners, unless you set about to abuse them, it's not going to happen. The wines are actually going to increase in quality so that whatever you paid for them at the outset, they're going to give you twice as much flavor quality at the point that you drink them if you wait long enough for them. So again, you get me going. You ask very open-ended questions.
Well, I like that because I know how you are, and more most importantly, that I find in the cellars that we build, you know, both for commercial and residential, is that Germany is probably the least represented in the cellars.
Yeah.
And we try to talk about, you know, how good these wines are, and it's like, to me, I found like the $30 and above for a Riesling, it's just like, they shut it down. If it's dry, they shut it down.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's thoughts on that?
Absolutely. A lot of thoughts on that. First of all, it more or less goes without saying that fine, let alone great German Riesling is at this point the best value that money can buy in the entire world of wine. And not only for what you are actually obtaining at the point of sale, at the moment you purchase, but for ageability. And Riesling, of course, almost unlike any other grape variety, undergoes such a metamorphosis that when it's mature, it's an entirely different creature than it was when you first bought it. I use the word metamorphosis because I don't know any other grape variety that really does this. Mature Riesling doesn't taste like young Riesling, and if you never had mature Riesling...
And when you say mature, how long from...
Well, let's take a Spätlese with pedigree.
Okay.
That wine will start
properly cellared.
Properly cellared, properly shipped, which we take care of, and properly stored.
Reefer containers.
Reefers in cold warehouse, and cold delivery vehicles, and then properly stored when it reaches the final consumer. Starts to really take on its tertiary characteristics become, I would say, prevalent, somewhere between around 13 and 17 years of age.
Wow.
And that doesn't mean, of course, that wine is necessarily at its peak. Its peak is determined by the tastes of each individual. Some people like a little more of the taste of old wine. Some people like a high common denominator between the tastes of freshness and the tastes of age. But again, a Riesling Spätlese with pedigree will go easily, even having been shipped to the US 35 to 40 years.
This is amazing.
In the original estate, where it has never been moved, you can drink those wines at 50 to 60 to 70 years, and they're still not only...
And constantly evolving.
Exactly. And they're still alive. See, I think there's a difference between old wine has a certain tiredness about it. And I don't particularly really like old wine unless there is something evocative in that tiredness. But I do like adult wine. I like mature wine. And people like my age, for example, in our mid to late 50s, I like to think are still vigorous. And I like to drink wines that are anthropologically or anthropomorphically equivalent to sort of my age, where they have quieted down some of their kind of puppy energy, and they may have lost their primary fruit, but they're still vigorous, they're still alive. So back to the notion of German wine and quality. I mean, if you're looking for that experience, there isn't anything else that'll deliver it. And dry Riesling will deliver an aspect of it, but not the full aspect of it. The reason for that is that fructose, of all the components in wine that develop, fructose develops most slowly. Sugar molecules begin to polymerize and they form longer molecular chains, and they create esterization and aldehydic development in the wines. Fructose, in other words, has its own fragrance and is of all of the components in Riesling wines with residual sugar, the one that is most conducive to long aging. People will very often talk about acidity in that respect, and acidity is important. But if acidity were the thing that was a sine qua non, if it was the most important thing, then the 1959 vintage would not have aged so magnificently. And great 59s are absolutely incredible to drink right now. And how many years on are we? And this was a low acid vintage.
Right.
So, I mean, by German wine standards. So it's not only acidity, it's total fruit density, and it's the balance of all components. It's also sulfur dioxide, the love that dare not speak its name, and but it's also residual sugar. So the dry Rieslings, you know, whereas I would say that the sweet Riesling can go 45 years, its dry equivalent can go 30.
Wow. What did you think about the 2010 that you were tasting?
2010 is a complete freak vintage in Germany. I've never seen one like it. No producer has ever seen one.
No year comparable?
No year is comparable. You look back into the archives, and seriously, you cannot compare. I have a producer in my portfolio that said, I have never seen a vintage like it. We had the must weights of the very best years, and we had the acidities of the very worst years.
Wow.
And one can talk for a long time about how that came about. But what you end up with is just an absolutely outsized concentration in these wines. They don't have 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. They've got 50 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. They are so crammed. They're like supernovas of flavor. And now, mind you, there are producers who made relatively classic wines in this vintage. So people who taste, for example, in my portfolio, who taste Schlossgut Diel or Helmut Dönhoff's wines, among others, will taste them and go, I don't know what Terry's talking about. These don't seem freaky at all. They seem like classic wines from these growers. But there is a large community of wines that just, they jump through hoops. It's as if some core of flavor in these wines were hit by a taser gun. And they're kind of just jerking and twitching and zzz, electric, and you just, like I say, they're the most extraordinary, agreeable freaks that I think I've ever seen. Because they're so different, and because they're so literally unprecedented, the question of what happens to them is wide open at this point. I will taste them again the first time since March, in about 3 weeks. And I tell you, I mean, I always go to my June tastings with held breath because I don't know what I'm going to encounter. And I'm in print now, having said what I said about the wines, you know, so I'm sweating bullets to make sure that they're going to live up to what I wrote about them. But this vintage 2010, I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna sleep the night before.
Wow.
It's not that I'm worried that the wines will be bad. I know they won't be. It's that a vintage without precedent is a vintage whose development you can't forecast.
Right.
Normally we have...
It's a wild card.
Exactly, it's a wild card, and normally we have a pretty decent instinct combined with our experience to indicate that certain vintages will maybe zigzag as they age. They'll go in and out of the shadows. Other vintages will age in a nice classic line. 08, for example, in Germany was a zigzag sort of vintage. 09 is going to be a very agreeable, uncomplicated, low maintenance, classically aging year. 2010, I don't know. I don't know. So after 30 some odd years drinking wine and 28 years in the business and 26 years importing German wines, to utter those words, I don't know, is a very interesting feeling indeed.
Mr. Han from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I don't know.
I don't know.
Where can some of our viewers check your wine out?
In the sense of being able to buy it?
Yes.